3:05, so I guess it's time for us to start. Thank you all for coming. And I'm really excited to tell you all about my last year that I spent in Papua New Guinea doing linguistic research, and to teach you some of the lessons that I was taught while I was there. So, as many of you know, but some of you don't, my name is Kate. I'm a PhD student in the linguistics department, and I'm a phonologist, which means that I study sound systems in language. How do sounds pattern, how do sounds change, and those sorts of things. For the past 3 years, I've been lucky enough to be working in the village of Limo, which two people here in the audience, actually, Catherine and Madeline, they've been to Limo, so they can tell you how wonderful it is. They're sitting up here in the front. While I was invited to come there about in 2015 by a team of language enthusiasts, Warama Krupel in particular, who had some goals for the community, and one of them was he wanted a dictionary and a grammar and some books for the school in the Yunde language, and they didn't have these at the time. So he asked for a linguist to come, and I'm not sure if I was what he expected, but there I came. And over the past 3 years, I've spent 11 months in the village. You can see where Ende is situated, right here in the middle of southern Papua New Guinea. For reference, this is Australia here, if the map continued. And Ende is surrounded by at least, and probably more, 7 languages. 3 of them are related, and 4 of them are completely unrelated. And this is within about a 30-kilometer radius. So it's a real hotspot of linguistic diversity. It's, for a linguist like me, it's a paradise. You've just got so many languages, and most of them are undocumented. We don't know much about many of these languages. There is one disadvantage, though, of doing linguistic research or writing a dissertation on a language that you don't know. And one of them is that the linguistic tools that you have in your head, you have to apply those to a language. And if you don't have that language inside your head, you have to get it from somebody else's head. And that, extraction process can be quite difficult. In 2015, when I first arrived, the first thing I learned was that I didn't know anything. If you can kind of compare this to, so for example, there are 2 machetes in these pictures. Here's Matthew Bodog. Actually, this isn't Matthew. This is Musato's husband. Do you remember his name? Not Matthew. This is Musato's husband. He has a 1.5, 2 foot long machete, and he's expertly cutting up a coconut for us to drink. Over the 11 months that I was there, the only thing that I could do reliably with a machete was balance it on my head. So both of us knew what a machete was. We knew what it was used for. We knew the principles, why have a machete. But only one of us was able to use it properly without hurting themselves. Similarly, I was able to identify the language. I was able to see where it was. I could observe it, but I didn't know how to use it. And I didn't know, I wasn't an active user of this language. So in order for us, the community, in order to reach the community's goals of a dictionary and a grammar, and to reach my goals of having a dissertation, we had to somehow bridge this disconnect between the linguistic tools that were in my head and the language that was in their head. There are 2 main ways in linguistics that we can use to access knowledge of language. If this knowledge of language resides in our heads, the first way is that every one of us speaks a language. So one way that we can access knowledge about language is by looking inside our own head at our own knowledge and doing research on that type of knowledge. It's kind of like a shortcut. So here is Andrew Dobola, who is writing down a story that he told himself. The other way that we can do research on linguistic knowledge is by looking into the heads of others. So we have many ways of getting at that knowledge by running experiments, by analyzing the types of speech that they produce, by simply asking them questions, by looking through an MRI. There's many things that we can do to try and see what knowledge of language looks like in other people's heads. So here's Andrew doing a different kind of task where he's writing down the story that somebody else told. Okay. I think in linguistics, some areas of linguistics have been criticized for using too much of this introspection, what's so-called armchair linguistics, using the shortcut between the knowledge in your head and the knowledge of linguistics. I don't think it's because this is necessarily a bad way of doing linguistics, but it's because they weren't doing enough of this type of linguistics, seeing if what we know about language because of what's in our own head, does that match up with what other speakers know about language? So today I'm arguing that particularly in research on minority languages, I think we have the opposite problem. We rely too much on the outside looking in, and we don't use this method of native speakers looking at their own language and providing us with native speaker-like intuition. I don't think we could, I think in order to have really informed and really engaging linguistic research, we need to do both methods. So one issue is that with minority languages, especially with communities that have lesser access to higher education or linguistics in general, there may not be any linguists in the community already. But through my research, I was able to transfer some of the linguistic tools and methods that I have learned by studying linguistics. And by teaching community members how to do this work, I was able to make that shortcut happen between the language and the tools. So in this talk, I'm going to go through 3 different ways in which this shift in methods has helped my research. The first thing that I did when I got to Limahl, and I think most linguists would do this, the first thing you do is you start to collect words if you don't know a language. There is a list called the Swadesh list. It has 200 of the most basic words like mother and water and tree. And so your first day, you kind of go around asking people, how do you say mother, and you write that down. How do you say tree, and you write that down. And I realized that when I started this, gathering this very first word list, that first of all, when people told me words, I wasn't able to write them down correctly the first time, and I had to ask them to repeat themselves over and over again. And this wasn't a very fun activity for them, and it wasn't a very fun activity for me. And looking back on my notes, I even realized that they weren't quite that accurate anyway. But it's really important to have a word list or a dictionary. And the reason why it's important to have these things, first of all, a dictionary is a documentation. It's a cultural document. It's a kind of a snapshot of the types of words people are using. You can kind of get a peek into what people care about. And when so you can kind of get a peek into what people care about. A word list or a dictionary is also really good for a phonologist. With a word list, you can see how many sounds are in the languages. How do sounds change when they're in different positions of the word? What does a typical word look like? Does it have like Russian with lots of consonants, or is it more like Hawaiian with la 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 type type structure? So what does the word to look at the sound systems of the language, having a basic word list is very helpful. When I realized that this wasn't going fast enough, I decided that it would be quicker for me to teach people how to write and how to write their own dictionary than it would be for them to teach me and I. And here is, I wonder if I can play this in my mouse. Here is one of the workshops in which a group of people came to start writing the dictionary. Once I stopped asking people to repeat words over and over, and actually gave them pen and paper and categories like write down all the words you can think of that go in a house, or write down all the birds you can think of, or something like that. People got really excited, and the workshops became actually very popular. Here's a peek. Maybe not. All right. There we go. No, it's not going to work, but or it's going to take a while to buffer. But so as you can see, there's between 10 and 15 people standing around. This man Joshua is writing down the words, and people are debating with him what's the best way to write it down, coming up with more words. It's kind of like it's kind of like a word board game, where you have to think of every word that you could find in the forest, or every type of animal. And this switching to these workshops had three major outcomes. First, the dictionary that was created, we were able to write down more than 3,000 words in just 3 weeks by having the speakers write down the words instead of me write down the words. And that was because I was the bottleneck in the process of going from their heads to paper. And even though I didn't write down every single one of these words, they did. That's how we got this big document so quickly. Something that wouldn't have happened if I had gone through this my way is that we actually had this document is a culturally specific word list. Some semantic categories that I was interested in, like the words for all the stars, for example. I had brought all these lists of all the English words for all the different stars and constellations. And in Limahl, where there isn't electricity, there's no air pollution, I thought you could see the Milky Way every night. I thought this would be like a great task to write down all the stars' names. There's 2 words for stars in Ende, a normal star and the morning star. So what dominated the dictionary actually were words for root vegetables, yams, taro, all kinds of different cassava. There are more than 100 or 200 words for different yams or taro, and some of you actually saw that while peeking through the dictionary earlier. So this document is now a much better reflection of what people talk about or what people have words for than if I had kind of mandated the types of categories that were going to be in the dictionary. The other thing is that people really liked finding lists of words that sounded the same, or words that or words that homonyms, words that sounded exactly the same but had different meanings, or words that rhymed. And that's something that a speaker of a language can do really quickly. But for me, I could ask for the word for dog and get durang, but I'd have to go through another 100 words before I'd get another word that sounded like durang, right? So that was another benefit. Also, because there were some people in the community that were pretty good at writing, but most people didn't have a lot of practice writing in Ende, and so there was a lot of discussion about the orthography in particular, and a lot of times words were getting written inconsistently. But that was actually very informative. There was, at the very beginning, there was a vowel that was constantly getting, everyone was always arguing about this vowel and how we should write this vowel down. And by the end of a week of arguing about it, we realized that it was actually 2 vowels and not just one. So the reason people were having these, intuitions, it wasn't something that I could see or even something that I could hear at the time, but it really helped with with figuring out just how many sounds were in the language. The next really important aspect that having native speaker collaborators, not just consultants but collaborators, was in recording in genres. So in linguistic research, natural speech, getting natural data, recordings of people speaking as if there weren't a recorder in the room, are kind of like the gold standard for doing analysis. And the problem was, I had 2 problems. First of all, I could be recording natural speech, but I wouldn't even know what natural speech sounded like if, even if I heard it. And second of all, I didn't know if I could actually get natural speech if I was present in the room, or in the area. There weren't really rooms, but if I was around, a lot of people spoke English. It's quite possible people were performing instead of speaking naturally. So by teaching skills in audio recording, microphone placement, and even transcribing, we were able to, send a team of speakers out to collect stories and collect recordings without me or any other linguist present. And I think this resulted in much better data. Something that happened at the very end of my last trip in 2018 was that a group of people went around and started collecting jokes, which we didn't have at all in the corpus up to that point. We maybe had maybe something like 90 or 95 hours of data, but there weren't any jokes in any of them. And I didn't really understand Ende jokes, and I wasn't asking for them, and so there we go, we didn't have any. But there are a lot of jokes, and one particular genre of joke is, I hope this is going to work for us. Where's my mouse? You can see it? There it is. Get this started. So one joke in particular, or one genre of jokes, is when somebody is learning a new language and somehow messes it up, somehow does a bad translation or gets a word wrong or gets something grammatical wrong. And it's probably for this reason that people really liked me and the other linguists being around, because we were constantly getting things wrong, so I'm sure that was hilarious. But this video, I'm really bummed that the internet isn't working for us. But this was an example of a woman telling a joke about when she was young. When she was young, her stomach was hurting. She went and sat down under a tree. Another, second grader came over and asked her what was wrong. She said that her stomach was hurting. He went and told the teacher, and he said, "Ina is the stomach, is the pain," which is a very direct translation of how you would say that in Ende, but of course isn't how you would say it in English. This young man, who is Kaugadobola, ended up growing up to be the elementary school teacher, and now has the best English probably in the village. So it may have had a little bit of irony in there too, that he had messed this up when he was young. If I can get them working later, I'll try again. Another type of data that I had to collect were a lot for my dissertation were verbal paradigms. An example of a verb paradigm in English would be like for the verb to be, I am, you are, he is, they are, we are, or in the past, I was, she was, he was, they were. In English, we have maybe like between 6 or maybe 10, but usually very, very few forms in these paradigms. In Ende, there's more than 100 different forms for all of these words. And I wanted to collect 500 verbs. And so this was a really big task. And here you can see Jerry Darida and Tony Worma seemingly very happy about this task. It's probably because we were quite early on in the elicitation, maybe verb 20. But it was very laborious, and Tony is a trooper, and he stuck with me to the end. But some verbs were boring. Some verbs were just perfectly regular, and when I would ask for a verb like, to sit, and they would start, letting me know the paradigm. If I sensed it was going to be regular, I was like, oh gosh, another regular verb, and they knew that didn't make me happy. But when they, when I asked, something, it could even be something very semantically similar, like to stand or to kneel or something, and it was irregular, that's what got me happy. And so they kind of got in tune to, what types of verbs might make me happy. And Tony in particular picked up on this. So for example, we got this verb pair pretty early on. This is bambarad, which means to expand, or something that's already kind of big to get even bigger. And then we have pamparat, which is to become big. And so something that started out small and actually became big. They both have, they both have very similar meaning, but something very slightly different that I actually never fully understood. But the difference between these two words, for anyone in here that's done phonology, is that the consonants here, b, and d, are all voiced, and the consonants here, p, and t, are all voiceless. So the distinction between these two is one of voicing, and the semantic distinction is one of bigness and smallness. And so this verb pair, made me very happy, and so Tony and I had a discussion about why, and we talked about how p and b, t and d, k and g, all the, this phonological pattern, how it works. And Tony was actually able to come up with 4 more of these pairs right off the top of his head. So gargir and karkir, to deleaf kind of roughly, or to take the leaves off something roughly, or to take the leaves off something, in a non-rough manner. Gagarud and kukurut, to cut leaves versus to split a leaf in 2. Dudarab and tutarab, to cut grass or flowers or to cut finely. And gugarab and kukurab, to weed in a big way, and often in a way that would require your mother to go tell you to weed it again, or to weed in a small way, kind of like a fine way. So in all of these examples, the voiced verb in the pair has something, either the subject is big, the object is big, or the motion is big, and the voiceless pair, you've got something that's small. Okay, so this type of pattern would have taken me a long time had I just kept mining the corpus or asking verbs by random, but Tony was able to come up with this very quickly. Another type of verb that I was very interested in or category of verb, were verbs that had floating nasals. So you can see these are 2 different forms in a single paradigm. In one form, the root begins with a nasal, so indug. And in another part of the paradigm, you get dunga. So the nasal has actually moved down, kind of floated to the right. And there's lots of verbs, more than 60 or 70, that do this. And every time, we came up with one of these verbs, it made me very happy. And eventually, Tony wrote me a big list of these types of verbs, and he was able to, very quickly, think of these verbs after we talked about, what a verb class is. And what's important is that the verbs that he came up with were verbs that I don't think I would have ever gotten in a corpus, like to smell on purpose, or to urinate on something, to disturb bees, or to decapitate. These are things that I probably wouldn't have asked for, and that probably weren't going to come up, even in very cruel jokes. I don't think we would have gotten them into the corpus. So working with Tony in this way the archive is, and my research was more informed. We've got way better data, and we were able to do it a lot faster. This would have taken years if, Tony hadn't offered this up. So the final project that I'm going to talk to you about, of course, is the movie. So in January of this year, I brought a projector to Limahl, a projector that runs off a solar panel and a solar battery. I also brought in a few documentaries about the ocean and about Australia and about California. Some people had seen movies on their cell phones, but most people hadn't seen, big movies or well-made movies in this way. And people really loved them. And I wished, every day I just wished that I had just brought more movies. And one man, Tony, he came up with the idea of making a documentary about Limahl. So I thought, of course, that this was a great idea. So we got a grant from the Firebird Foundation, and the Firebird Foundation supported us with video cameras, extra headphones, microphones, an extra laptop for doing editing, and even another solar panel to help us power the computer. It also gave us compensation for the people who volunteered their time to work on the film. So that made it a little bit easier to get volunteers. Once we had the equipment, I began an 8-week technology class. So every day at 4 p.m. for 2 hours, for 8 weeks, we learned how to use this equipment. We studied video recorders, audio recorders, still cameras. We learned a bit about the computer, how to use the mouse, how to type, how to move folders around. And we, every day after the class, the group would get together and discuss the movie and about what it was going to be about, what the scenes were going to be like, what types of costumes were needed, what types of special effects were needed. So it was a very group project. Here you can see Tony directing one of the scenes. Each scene, we would spend 1 day filming, practice filming the scene, what it might look like, where we would set up the cameras, who might say something, and then the next day we would get into costume and film it. So that's kind of how that worked. This movie, you can see this woman here and this man here. They're actually the protagonists of the film. As you're going to see, the film is about 4 of the oldest people in the village, and about how in the 1950s, early 1960s, some missionaries came from upriver, and these 2 couples went with them upriver to go to Bible school for 3 years, and then they came back to Limo and the neighboring village of Malam to tell them about the Bible and about God. And so these 2 people were the protagonists. But the film itself, the goal of the film was to teach the young people in the village what life was like before these couples went away to Bible school, before there was churches, before there was clothing, before there was healthcare, before people gave up traditions like magic. So the first half of the film is kind of reminding the children what life used to be like, and the second half of the film is the story of these two couples. Tony Warama here, he directed most of the scenes, and he also wrote the narration, and he was also one of the main people that kind of conscribed people to volunteer as actors, to volunteer their costumes, and his wife Wendy did a lot of the filming. Once all the footage was recorded, and I think we collected, I don't know, maybe 20 hours of footage, it was edited using free video editing software that came on this HP computer, and we basically just stitched, I did the stitching of the scenes together, but there was a lot of people around telling me what to do, adding special effects when they were needed, and then at the end adding subtitles. We supplemented the film with some candid footage that I had taken with my phone or with the camera throughout the trips that I had been on, and some of the footage that some other linguists had taken as well. Okay, this is one of my favorite scenes from the film, and it is something that I don't think we would have been able to capture had the film not been kind of initiated by the community. It was also one of the scenes that I was the most worried about. So before the missionaries came, the old men used to practice magic, and they used to practice magic in secret, and it used to be out in the forest. And for the first 3 years when I was there, everyone told me no one practices magic anymore, everybody's forgotten it, our ancestors have died, nobody does it, you don't have, I don't know if it was like you don't have to worry kind of thing, or just it's not around anymore, sorry kind of thing. But but everyone was insistent that there be a scene about magic in the movie. So I was worried about how it was going to go down, and so I thought, well, they wanted to have this scene to have an old man teaching 2 young men how to practice magic, and I thought, okay, well maybe in this scene we'll have an old man and 2 young men sitting together, and he would just be talking to them, and then we'd have the narrator say, and then he taught them magic. And that wasn't it. So as soon as everybody got dressed, everybody started sitting down. All of the old people ran back to their houses, pulled out all their magic stuff, brought it back into the circle and said, if we're going to do this, we're actually going to do this. And so there's only about maybe 45 seconds of it in the movie, unfortunately. But the older man that did this performed an entire magic ceremony for over an hour. And it was a healing ceremony. And so it was something that had never been talked about, and I think for not just for me, but everyone else in the audience that was watching this, from any young people, I think under 40, it was the first time that they had seen this performed in front of them. And because the film was being made for the children and not for a foreign audience, I think that it was authentic. I think they were doing it, for themselves, not like in exaggeration. My second favorite scene is this scene in a deer hunting scene. So here's a deer. This deer has already been shot and killed, and it is now being propped up with branches And right now they're disguising the branches with leaves, and so it looks like the deer is just kind of standing there, waiting to get shot again, but on camera. You'll see that this whole scene is in the film, so you'll see it, but maybe now you'll pay a little bit more attention. So after this deer gets shot again, a big group of hunters rushes towards the deer and kind of has to like pull it off of its little prop in order for it to fall down like a normal deer would. And then then they take a step back, and then the scene kind of resumes. And when I was watching it, I was like, oh my gosh, this looks so fake. Like, this does not look like a deer getting shot. And I'm like, this, most of the, all the other scenes look so good. And I was like, oh, this looks so fake. But then the conversation that these guys have after this man shoots an already dead deer, he steps back and he just starts boasting about this deer that he shot. And the other guys are like, wow, you got it right in the heart. And everyone's, congratulating him and celebrating. And they're like, we're going to go home and show our wives all this deer that we caught, And so they're so happy, and it's so authentic. And just the contrast between, how fake this was and how authentic the conversation was after. I don't know if we would have been able to get that type of conversation into the archive in any other way. The funny thing was, this, I don't know if I want to tell you this, but when we played this scene over and over again, and I was asking everyone, like, is there anything that you want to change about this scene to make it a little more realistic? They said, well, yeah, the deer. And I said, well, and I'm like, well, what can we do? And they're like, well, the real problem is that the deer didn't scream when it got shot. And so we're like, okay, so we need to have a deer scream in the movie. And they're like, yeah, well, how are we going to get a deer scream? So there was an audition for who could sound the most like a dying deer, and I won. So I think that is the biggest contribution that I made to this movie is my dying deer scream, and you will hear it. But overall, I think you'll see that this movie is, it involved a lot of work. It was, people really put their whole hearts into it. We didn't have fancy software. We didn't even have electricity. And I haven't touched it since I've been back and had the internet and learned how to do things in a better way. But before I give the rest of the movie away, I think we should just watch it. And afterwards, I think we'll have time for questions about the movie. And this one isn't online, so it should work.